Hi, I'm Sky Bristol with the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver, Colorado. This is a talk for the ESIP and CDI IT&I Tech Working Group meeting on October 11th, 2018. Sorry, I can't be there in person, but I'm going to try to share some of the stuff that we've been working on and point you all at a idea campaign that we're working through the ESIP lab for some better ideas on how to go about this stuff. So I'm going to start with kind of the end in mind in terms of one of the end members that we're trying to get to in this work to create a spatial feature registry or a spatiotemporal feature registry in reality in terms of having both space and time about features that we have some interest in. This is a view of our National Biogeographic Map. This is a kind of major new effort for my particular area of USGS where we're working to bring biogeography into the same sort of context with the national topographic, hydrographic, and other mapping layers, the geologic map, and those pieces that we're responsible for. Part of our major focus is to provide different kinds of analyses associated with biogeography and changes in species and habitats, the different kinds of protections for those, the sorts of threats that they face, and in a way that can help decision makers have a better understanding of what's going on and make better informed decisions. And so we're putting a lot of focus into this idea of analysis packages, we've called them. It's sort of a way of packaging a scientific workflow along with all of the documentation and source information and everything that needs to go behind that into a map context. And our latest release that we just put out a couple of weeks ago produces these analyses focused on different kinds of geographic areas of interest. And so in the map tool, we provided a way of running a search in some way. You can do something like look for Yellowstone National Park. You start typing it in and you get a list of potential places with Yellowstone in them. And within this list, you'll see we have a number of different things. We've got the national park, we have wilderness study areas, we have marine protected areas that have Yellowstone or yellow and stone in them in this particular case because of the search index that it's running against. We have different counties, we have ecoregions, we have a lot of different kinds of places of interest that we care about. But we can go in and pick one of those. Our map then gets the geometry for that particular area, as well as identifiers for that area, works against the different sets of analysis packages that we have, and either sets things up to send that geometry off to a particular set of services to bring back different kinds of data. Like in this case, it will run against a set of geoprocessing services provided by the U.S. National Phonology Network across space and time to present a particular analysis in some way. And so this will take just a second, run live against those services, and come back and return a set of results and display those in charts and lay those out for somebody to take a look at. Another way of getting to places of interest is to just click in the map somewhere. So if you click, it drops a point and then allows me to choose from places that are underneath that particular area. In this case, if I click Middle Rockies, it's a level 3 ecoregion. I get back a number of other possibilities because there are some analyses that instead of needing to run against the actual geometry of that place, have been pre-calculated to return results for this particular type of feature, the Middle Rockies Amernic ecoregion level 3. So you'll see here we've got a view of fish habitat condition and the different disturbances associated with that. If we click that particular guy, our mapping tool will go out and draw a different layer on the map to make different kinds of data available. We have protection status of ecological systems. So this is looking at particular vegetation groups in that area and how well protected they are within that area versus the larger contiguous U.S. Protection status of terrestrial vertebrate species. and we're continuing to work on all the tools and everything that comes together around all of this. So that's another topic, but what we're really interested in here is the spatial feature part of this. How did we get these spatial features together? How are we interacting with them? How are we maintaining them over time? So for our work, we focused a lot on trying to build this API first that's behind all of that. So moving back from a particular application, we've developed an API. We built this in a framework, for those of you interested, called Flask using REST+. So it's a Python-based API system based on a nice framework that generates this Swagger type of documentation directly into an interface like this so people can work with it in some way. So behind what we were just looking at there is this API. So we can search text. If we go in here, we can type in Yellowstone, and we'll get back the same set of results if we execute on that we saw in the web application. They come back in a JSON structure. In this case, the data is actually being piped directly through, or this API is executing a search against a set of indexes stored in Elasticsearch, bringing the data back, formatting it in a slightly different way, and then outputting it for use through the API. And so you can see in here we have a set of hits that come back from that search. There's a concept in here of an identifier and a feature class. That's the little type designation that we saw in the user interface there a minute ago. There's a collection of source data in some cases, a name, and then potentially for some of these features, a longer description that can be associated with that. Likewise, if we search on a given point, and put in values, we can drop in, these sample values that were here, and execute that. It'll look at that particular place, put a little buffer around that point, and look for intersecting features that are associated with that. So we get back similar kinds of information depending on what it was that we looked at. And then if we have a particular feature like this Landscape Conservation Cooperatives feature that we have right here, we can go run this particular route, the feature route, try that out, put in that feature identifier, and we can execute that and get back a set of results for that particular area. And this result set will include the geometry of that feature, so that we can then send that off to other services or display it on a map or do whatever we want to do with it from that point. Likewise, some of these other services, service endpoints that are here, gap metrics and NIFAP metrics, those will also take one of those same types of feature identifiers and return that set of results. So these are APIs that instead of running a live calculation against the geometry of a feature, are going out and taking an identifier, passing that in some particular way and bringing back the data. And sometimes that identifier type of URN type of syntax we have here for a universe or a uniform resource name kind of identifier, or it could just be the FIPS code 8, and our system knows how to take that particular part of the identifier, run against the system, or we program that into the API in terms of how it's actually retrieving data in some particular way. So that's a little bit of what we're trying to get to. Now I'd like to unwind and show how we're trying to get to that particular point, some processes that we're working through to get there in terms of data management and data processing, and hopefully open this up for ideas on how we could do it better. And there's a bunch of stuff that we're a little bit naive about in our learning about how to put these pieces together. And so we're really hoping some more knowledgeable folks from the broader community can come up with some ideas to get there. So a lot of the stuff that we have to deal with really comes down to negotiating for the long term where these different kinds of features are coming from and how we should go about maintaining them over time and distributing the data from those features into a variety of different kinds of endpoints, not just our particular API and applications for it, but there are many other ways that we need to process and use spatial features of interest and do things to them and with them over time. And that's really where this idea of a registry comes in. So a registry is, a place where you register something. You register some item and its information, and you register it so that other things can pick it up from that registry and decide what to do with it and where to go with that information. So I'll walk through an example of one of these and point to some others that we have, and share some of the thinking about how to handle that point of registration and what to do with it in some way. So in our particular case, we're taking advantage of a system we have called ScienceBase, which is a digital repository and cataloging system and sort of generalized tool set for managing lots of different kinds of data items that we have in the USGS. It's one of our trusted digital repositories for data releases and publishing and that sort of thing that we do. We took advantage of it for this process because it gave us a flexible information model to feed stuff into, a nice persistent data store that we can pretty much count on being there, an API that we can work against so that we can write code that handles the stuff that's in here in a particular way. And just a trusted place that we can set things up. So in this case, we're looking at actually a set of features that we haven't yet processed through our pipeline. I just did some work on these the other day to kind of work at a method for capturing the details of a given source and its mapping and what we should do with it in some way. So these are a set of ecosystems defined through a relatively robust scientific process over time that's managed through the IUCN and a number of other organizations. And we often want to use these kinds of groupings or these kinds of marine areas to to run different kinds of analyses, to talk about the different types of species or habitats that are in those areas and analyze them and compare them over time to see how things are changing and report on them in some meaningful ways. So this set is here. We've got a ScienceBase item associated with it. We've captured some information about that, who's responsible for it in terms of the original investigator and investigators that were involved in the work. We have some links to information online that provide the download for the data, the particular zipped shapefile that was used. We've provided a purpose and some other stuff associated with this. And the part that I'm going to focus on is what we've stashed here as actual files for processing, and then how we've documented the stuff that's in those files for this purpose of registering these large marine ecosystems. So we did stash this original zip file that's dated from last year in April. It's a shapefile form. This is kind of the base source data that was provided to help to put these data out and online. We did that because we're not entirely sure if this source is always going to be around. Maybe we want to be able to get back to it and reprocess the data at some future point. So that's kind of a decision point that we make to go ahead and stash the data if if something's a little bit tenuous in terms of the original source and what we should do with those in some way. And then we also have, in this case, a zip file that I've called source data package, and that's what I'm going to get into a little bit here. This source data package in this case is the thing that we've teed up for processing through this pipeline, and it really contains two parts, and we'll look at those. One of those in particular. One is a GeoJSON form of the data. We didn't necessarily need to have it in GeoJSON, but what I needed to do in this case was incorporate both the geometry and the attributes that were part of this original data set that was in a shapefile form, but I needed to add this textual description into them that comes from this website that we want to be able to have as part of the descriptive information for better searchability and explaining to people what these large marine ecosystems are. So there was kind of a nice abstract for each one of the 66 large marine ecosystems, or actually 64 of the 66. So I picked those up online and incorporated those into a GeoJSON. And that's also a typical thing that we have to do in a lot of cases where you know, there's some good information online, but it may not all be together in the best mobile format for us to be able to use. We might have to assemble a few pieces together, run some basic pre-processing, or you know, a little bit of work on the data in order to set it up for actual use. So I did that in this case. One of the other pieces I need to plug back in here is a little bit of Python script that I use to do that work, process the shapefile, add the other stuff into it and all of that, and I just need to clean that up in terms of what this item looks like. But the part I want to really focus on today is the documentation piece then within this source data package, and share an idea that we're still very much evolving, and I think some folks from the community might be able to give us some ideas on how we should go about that. So I started fiddling around a bit with, okay, what's the essential information I need to provide about this source if somebody's going to take it and process it, and if we're going to run it through our particular pipeline and get to where we need to go in terms of the data that you see back in this API. So I started fiddling with JSON schema, and again, there's lots of ways of describing the stuff that's in data in some particular way, but you know, I hadn't messed with schema in a while, with JSON schema in a while, and I thought, let's give this a shot, see what's in there, and you know, what's missing from there, and how we might be able to use that format for describing things. You can go clear back to entity attribute information in FGDC, CSDGM XML, or feature catalogs in ISO 191, that family of standards. There's lots of ways of describing what's in a data set, of course, but you know, and maybe some of those could be leveraged here or could be useful, but I needed a way of getting at the sort of essential variables that would describe how to deal with this data in this registry context and carry that forward. I thought, well, let's fiddle around with JSON schema just a little bit. So there's this great tool, JSONschema.net, I played with just to get things started on this. It kind of applies the rules of the road for the different versions of the JSON schema over time, so that's kind of nice. I threw a little snippet of the JSON, of the GeoJSON structure from that data set that we processed in there, hit the infer schema process, and built out the stub of what the schema should look like. Walked through it, used some of the features that are in this tool for editing the schema in a particular way. I could go down into the individual properties and give them basic information and provide that back and then output that particular schema. Then I took that off into another tool and spent a little bit of time filling in the blanks and thinking about some of the other aspects of what needed to go into the schema to tell downstream processing tools how to deal with the stuff that was in here, how to get it into our particular mapping and the format that we're trying to get toward, and deal with some of the dynamics of how do we assign feature identifiers in a reasonable way for this particular thing. So what we have here is a view of that JSON schema, the latest version of that. This is packaged together in the zip file over here, the source data package, along with the GeoJSON itself. We could potentially incorporate all of this information into the same document if we wanted to do that. But here we've described the different data properties. We've specified that 3 of these, the number, the name, and the description, are required in this case. I provided a little bit of information on what that particular attribute means in this particular data set. We left the same property names, LME_number, all in caps, that were used in the original data set. Included a few other parameters that we may not really be using in our particular case, but they're useful source data for maybe other purposes. JSON schema has some nice features of being able to provide min max on individual properties, to set a pattern in kind of a subset of regular expression language that can be used to validate the variables. I didn't get deep into sort of all the things that we could do in that particular way. That's work for later on down the line. but we did work through the basics of how to deal with that. We added some other things into the schema that really made sense. I did incorporate a coordinate reference system in here. That's not something that is necessarily always done within a JSON schema, but I found a method for doing that that seemed to make sense for using the GeoJSON specification for supplying the coordinate reference system. In this case, it's the geographic data system that we provided back that was in the original source data in the shapefile form of the data, just encoded for GeoJSON here. The part of this that I extended a bit, and I'm really not quite sure about in terms of is this the right way to go or not, was some way of signaling right within this same document where I've specified this source and registered it essentially for use. What is the mapping between the variables or the values that you see in this particular data set and some larger construct of properties that we want to try to get to in some way, the things that we see back in this particular API. So here, I don't know if it's valid at all. I found some references in the JSON schema spec to being able to extend it essentially with additional attributes that kind of aren't in the base specification. But I borrowed some concepts from JSON linked data and how to encode the mappings to a particular vocabulary in some way. And we're going to keep fiddling around with this and consulting people who really know how to do this kind of stuff to see if it's at all valid. But I added an at context in here, specified a particular vocabulary, and then indicated the mapping essentially between the properties that are found here and referenced within the JSON schema that are from that source data set to these larger concepts that we're trying to map to, at least in our particular case. And I can imagine actually specifying for any given source data set a number of different valid contexts like this, that if you wanted to build this sort of index, this is what you would use. If you want to build this other kind of index, then use these definitions over here in some way in this kind of mapping to produce those things. I also included a couple of signals essentially in this context to say for the namespace ID, which should ultimately be also in some sort of a registry with a resolvable source behind it, and for feature class identifiers, use these literal string values. Use LME for the namespace ID and large marine ecosystems for the feature class. So that essentially signals that if I'm building a uniform resource name out of this, I would use LME colon along with this value for the LME number, which maps to this concept of source identifier. So I put those two together and I'd end up with LME colon 23 or something like that as a logical feature identifier that puts that ID in context, sets it up in a meaningful way, and then I can start building out applications on top of that. So to get to a vocabulary source, I fiddled around with the ESIP COR, the community ontology repository, because that seemed like a logical place to capture, okay, for this work that we're doing, here's an ontology that specifies these different properties, gives you definitions of what they are, and maybe gives us an extensible resource that over time we can build additional stuff into. So that's sitting over here. It's live as a test ontology in the community ontology repository. All of these different concepts like the namespace identifier are defined in here with a little bit of textual information that says what they are and some sort of a title that I can use as an easy way of referencing this thing. We might add additional properties in here associated with these particular integrating properties, as we've called them, to essentially signal maybe to processing software, this is the kind of thing that you should do with this thing. This is a logical algorithm that can be applied with this particular property if found in a source data set to do some particular thing that we're trying to get to. So we haven't gone very far with this yet. It's a really simple, dumb ontology. but it at least provides us a useful source that we can also program against if we want to go read the information back in JSON or some other format into an application and try to do something with it from that point. So the next steps on this are to go back to our what we've called the SFR pipeline, the essential set of processors that run to take all of those source data, figure out what to do with them based on what's in that JSON schema document, and build out the index that drives the API, or the indexes that drive the API in different logical ways. Right now, there's a set of technologies behind this that are really all driven by these Python scripts that basically say, do all of this stuff with this particular data. We go out and get some config files that I'll look at here in just a second in just a little bit more detail. We process the data using a function from another custom Python package that I'll point to here in just a second as well to build the data into a PostGIS database. We execute some logic to build out a materialized view, and that's captured in this code repo right now as well. And then we pipe all of that into Elasticsearch. So that's what this particular piece of script does. The pipeline configs are housed here. We can look at one of these. This basically provides the parameters that indicate a science-based item identifier, what table to put it into, some stuff about the coordinate reference system that should be found there. Again, what I'm looking to do is provide some of the same information via that JSON schema document as opposed to building it into these sort of config files. We've got another set of config files in here essentially that set up the SQL statement needed to build a materialized view. And here you can see the basic logic that takes that original source information and decides what it should be mapped to in terms of these higher level parameters that we're getting to. So this was one of my goals, is to provide that essential config information that's needed into a pipeline like this that can be more generalized to just read the JSON schema, do what it needs to do, and push those data into an index. And then the final step here basically does some other work using a configuration of details that work against that package that I mentioned, the Python package, to go pick up the data, put them into a particular Elasticsearch index in this case that gets dropped out. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but just to point to where that whole piece of things lives, there's a package we've currently called PyBis, although if we ever register this with PyPy, we're going to have to rename it because somebody else much smarter than us has already taken PyBis, so we'll call it something else. This particular package was, or this particular module for that was written by one of the developers on our team, Jake Juzak, who's responsible for a lot of the technical work behind this. So all of those functions that we were seeing referred to back in there within the pipeline are actually executed through this Python code in the package to generate what we're after. So that's kind of a quick rundown. I know I jumped through some things pretty quickly there at the end. What I'm really interested in at this point is to get some feedback and some ideas on sort of thinking that we have here that's completely wacky and not right on, maybe some ways that we're interpreting things like JSON schema, ways of leveraging that maybe you're kind of dumb and there are some better ways of doing that. And a place to contribute your ideas is going to be out on the ESIP idea scale system. We've launched a campaign, let's see, here called Building a Spatio-Temporal Feature Registry. We laid out a few of the basic ideas here in some initial documentation on it, and we've started posting some ideas back and forth. We've had just a little bit of input on that so far, but I'm really looking for others to jump in and help us to deal with this particular issue. And so I really invite anybody to jump in on this, contribute your ideas, let us know what you're thinking about and how we should maybe go about working on this in some new ways. So thank you very much for your attention, and love to get your comments here in the video online via the idea scale or email or whatever suits you in terms of getting back to me and sharing what you're thinking about.